One of the most common and easiest mistakes that we can make in our Angular projects is to allow our files to get too large in size. Files that are jammed with lots of code can be not only difficult to read, but also difficult to find existing functionality. And when finding existing functionality in our applications becomes too difficult, that can lead to code duplication. So I've come up with some strategies to help keep file sizes under control. And now let's take a look at a few of them. Let's first take a look at how we can keep the size of our services under control. Here in the demo application I've been using in this series, I have a core folder which contains a services folder. And in this services folder, we have already 5 service files, one of which is the API service file. Now, you might have expected that this file would be really big, that it would contain lots of HTTP GET and POST and PUT calls to our backend for the various resources in our project. If we were to put all of the HTTP calls into a single file, as our application grows, as the backend grows, and as the number of resources grows, so too with this single API service file. So instead, what I've opted to do is I've created an API service file for each resource. Specifically, there's an accounts resource for the application, so there's an accounts API service file. And as you can see, this file contains an HTTP GET call to retrieve accounts from the back end. Not only can we retrieve all of the accounts from the back end, but we can also retrieve accounts for customers via this HTTP GET call that has a query parameter. And we can also retrieve the account type of a specific transaction. So this accounts API service file contains all of the backend calls that pertain to the accounts resource. The same goes for the customers resource. And as you can see, this customers API service file is even bigger because it contains HTTP post calls and a put call and a delete call. Now, just imagine if the code that's contained in this customers API file were in the same file as the accounts API service file and the jurisdictions service file and the transaction service file. So by breaking these up into individual files, we can better control how large the size of each of these files gets. Now, of course, sometimes we need to transform or modify the data that is retrieved from the back end. So we also need in our services code that performs transformations on backend data. And instead of adding that type of functionality to our API services, one of the ways in which we can also keep file size of services under control is by creating services for specific components and directives. An example of that I have here in the shared folder. I have here a component called the customer card component. And notice this component has its own service called the customer card service. And this customer card service injects all of the API resource services. So it's injecting the customer service, the account service, the transaction service, and the jurisdiction service. And it does that in order to create a customers array that consists of the customers array from the customer service file, as well as account information and jurisdiction information and transaction information. So I created a service specifically for this component that does transformation on the API backend data. And that's one of the ways in which we can keep these service files small, because in looking at this customer's observable property, it's pretty big. It's got a lot of code. And just imagine if this were also in the customer's API service, it would make that file even bigger. So one strategy in keeping our services small is to separate out the service functionality from the transformation functionality. Now, if we needed to share this transformation functionality that's in the service that's specifically for the customer card component, let's say we wanted to share this code and manipulate the customer data in this same way. If we wanted to share that functionality, instead of creating a service that's specifically for the component, we could create a service that could be shared by multiple components. And we would then place this service in a shared services folder as we have here. So in summary, the ways in which we keep our service code under control is to separate out the API functionality from the transformation functionality. And with the transformation functionality, we can create services that are used by specific components and directives. And if there are components and directives that share service functionality, then we can create a shared folder of services that can be accessed by multiple components and directives. Another type of Angular file that tends to get very big very quickly are our style files or our SCSS files. There's built-in functionality in Scss processing that helps us control the size of our Scss files, our SCSS files, and that mechanism is called a Scss partial. Let's take a look at how we can use Scss partials in our Angular projects. So I'll first close up some of these folders, and let's first take a look at the SCSS file of the app component. And as you can see, the app component does not have CSS code in it. Instead, it consists of imports. And actually, instead of imports, we're using the use function. So in our application SCSS files, you're going to see we'll never have CSS code. Instead, we'll have these imports. And what these files are they are Scss partials. And it's the Scss partial that contains the CSS code. So for the app components.scss, I've created an SCSS folder. And in that SCSS folder are all of the Scss partials. And Scss partials, the file names begin with an underscore. So here is the content SCSS file that you see here in the import. Here's the global, here's the header, and here's the footer. So I've created smaller partial files that contain specific types of code. In the case of the content partial, it contains the CSS code for a CSS selector called content. The footer partial contains the CSS code for the footer class, as you might expect. The globals partial contains the code for the host pseudo class, and of course, the host pseudo class for any component is the component itself. And then I have a header partial, which contains the code for the header of the app component. Now, just imagine if we put all of this code that's in each of these files into our app component.scss file. We'd have a good deal of code. And typically the app component tends to have less code than other components in our application. So being able to break our code out into manageable pieces, into partials, helps us to better understand the code that's in each file, as well as it helps us to better locate CSS code for particular parts of our components. By naming our partials header and footer and content and global, we're naming the partial files with the parts of the component where their code is specifically used. And the way in which I have created partials for the app component, I've also created a similar SCS folder for the components in the shared folder. Now, there's one other type of SCSS folder that is more of a global folder. It's not associated with any one component. And that is the SCSS folder that I have here. It contains global layout SCSS code, global root SCSS code like colors and links, and global typography CSS code. And because these files are not associated with a specific component, we have to have Angular bootstrap these files into the project. And the way in which we go about that is we modify the angular.json file by adding to the options object in the build object, we add a property called style preprocessor options, and we set that property to an object that has a property called the include paths, and that include paths is an array. And that array consists of the folders that contain partials that we want to share throughout the entire application. Those folders that contain partials that are not associated with a specific component. So as you can see, in this application, I've included the layout folder, the root folder, and the typography folder. And that will ensure that all of the partials in those folders can be used throughout the application. And we can see that in the customer card component in the items partial, I'm actually using the colors partial that comes from the root folder, the shared root folder. So there you have it. 2 strategies we can use to keep the sizes, the file sizes of our services and CSS files under control. And by doing this, we make our code easier to read, easier to understand, and easier to maintain and extend. I hope you found this video helpful, and please do leave a comment and subscribe so that you can receive the next videos in our series. Until I see you in the next video, keep on coding.